Welcome viewers to another thought-provoking segment on Ottolina TV. Today's discussion promises to venture into the depths of political dynamics and technological ascendancy, all from a unique vantage point. And for that, we owe a debt of gratitude to Bien of Dazibao, who has expertly steered this interview with Prof. Josef Gregory Mahoney at his Shanghai residence. Dr. Mahoney is a professor at East China Normal University. He's a vanguard of political thought and an influential figure straddling the realms of academia and media with finesse. He crosses paths with the complex corridors of international relations, political studies, and the progressive ideologies shaping our times. Professor Mahoney's roles are manifold: an executive director at the International Center for Advanced Political Studies, an authoritative voice as Vice Dean for the Institute of Singularity Politics, and a crucial editorial presence for scholarly publications. His reach extends beyond academic forums, resonating through the airwaves of global media powerhouses. With a track record of over 700 broadcast appearances on platforms like Al Jazeera, BBC, and CGTN, Dr. Mahoney has carved out a niche as a go-to commentator on China's intricate dance with global powers. He has also lent his expertise to China Daily and the South China Morning Post, elucidating the finer points of China's political chess game for a worldwide audience. In this exclusive interview, we're set to peel back layers on the new quality productive forces concept that Professor Mahoney elucidates, a topic he's passionately vocal about. It's a concept interwoven with the fabric of China's economic framework and indicative of its strategic foresight in global economic reconfiguration. Mahoney is not just interpreting these forces, he's part of the narrative, having been instrumental in translating Jiang Zemin's selected works, offering Western audiences an inside look at China's political thought. Today, we plunge into Mahoney's analysis of the Chinese Communist Party's factional architecture, examining the enduring influence of Jiang's three represents, the Shanghai faction's legacy and the Youth League's momentum. Professor Mahoney brings to the table his rigorous examination of these forces, which he has explored through his extensive work with international think tanks and media outreach. We can't thank Bien enough for capturing this rare dialogue, and we extend our sincere appreciation to Dr. Mahoney for sharing his own and insights. Prepared to engage with ideas that challenge the status quo and provide a deeper understanding of the strategic interplay at work in China's ascent. Stay tuned to Ottolina TV. This is where profound conversations happen.
First of all, Professor, what is the new quality productive force?
So let's talk about the new quality productive forces. And I think before we do this, we need to recognize that whenever we see terminology like productive forces, that this is a Marxist concept, right? Second, that we should distinguish this concept, this new concept from Xi Jinping, from a concept that was introduced by Jiang Zemin in Sangadaibiao, the three represents, where he talked about the advanced productive forces, right? Yeah. Now, in the case of the advanced productive forces, what Jiang Zemin had, this is the third generation of leadership, was generally interpreted as understanding the expanding role that private enterprise was playing in Chinese development, GDP generation, employment, and so forth and so on. But advanced productive forces at that time was also generally understood as code for giving theoretical justification for including capitalist in the party, which is something that we see starting during Jiang's time in office. So how are new quality productive forces different, right? What they refer to are things like AI, quantum computing, and to some extent green innovation and green transitions. We can understand them as smart city concepts. These other, tech-led solutions that some people believe are starting a new tech revolution in economies. Now, I know that some people don't believe that, but the belief seems to be in China that these are in the vanguard of driving new economic models. And if China wants to be competitive with the United States, so for example, many studies indicate right now that the US is number one in AI, but China is number two, right? And if China wants to try to sustain technology, not letting that gap expand, which, by the way, the U.S. is really trying to encourage with the tech blockade that it's in tech decoupling that it's putting in place, that China needs to really push those technologies in order to keep pace with competition. But China also understands that it has some technological advantages, especially in green tech, because the U.S. Legacy industries suppressed that development for so long. But in any event, China also has some advantages in AI and other technology development and ability to bring it into its companies.
How did the decision of develop the new productive force come about at the political level?
Let's add a little context here. In my analysis, the U.S. had long had this idea that the more the Chinese economy developed, the more out of sync it would become with the Chinese political system, and that eventually this would cause the Chinese political system to collapse. Now, that hasn't happened, of course, and what we have seen is that the party has continued what was in fact observed many, many years ago, even long before Xi Jinping took power, this incredible capacity for adaptation and change. But the real issue was before Xi Jinping took power, the party was gridlocked between different factions. In fact, there were many factions that had disrupted the Leninist nature of the party, but the two biggest were the Shanghai faction, which was primarily related to the third generation of leadership led by Jiang Zemin, and the Tuan Pai, or the Young Communist League faction, associated with Hu Jintao in the fourth generation. And so the general way of thinking is that the third generation, which had been the initial leader of a lot of the major reforms, but especially in the wake of joining the WTO, which is where you really see China take off, that they themselves were too invested in these industries and things like the property market that had become incredibly inflated and bloated under their control. And they had, of course, resisted creating alternative avenues for investment. And so the property market kept overheating. And of course, we have problems in the wake of 2008, where China didn't have a system like the Federal Reserve, but they could compel state-owned banks to give state-owned enterprises loans that they didn't need, and in this way protect liquidity. But this is also where we begin to see these state-owned enterprises becoming, the biggest companies in the world, and incredibly bloated and inefficient. So the problem is, although there was a lot of progress made during the Hu Jintao years, fundamental structural reforms were not put in place. And this was because of the gridlock within the party itself. So we will have the anti-corruption campaign, and that's needed to get rid of corruption. But it's also what, in Marxist terminology, we would call a party rectification campaign. And so the real concern here is that we need to rectify the party so that we can push through the structural reforms that are long overdue. So, you know, there was some hope, certainly in the West, that Xi Jinping would fail with the anti-corruption campaign, that the party would in fact collapse, and that the reforms would not be started. And even if the party didn't collapse, China would slip into the middle income trap. Once it becomes clear that Xi Jinping's reforms are going to work, that he is going to effectively consolidate the anti-corruption campaign, this is when the United States launches the trade war. So we might understand this if we imagine, and I know this would require a significant leap of faith for some of your listeners, if we imagine that the United States is capable of strategic thinking and not being purely reactionary, right, then we might say, okay, then the U.S. launches the trade war. Yes, this will serve Trump's populism, but Trump is also being led by the military at this point because of the collapse of the CIA, both in terms of their idea about China, but also their human communications network was hacked. And they lost a lot of their agents in China and Iran and a few other places. We know this because a CIA whistleblower filed a lawsuit revealing this information in court. But anyway, and this is why Trump brings so many military people in to his administration, because the U.S. starts relying on the military to help inform its strategic thinking, because the CIA has been discredited. And the military always sees things, assesses things in terms of threats, right? And this is where we move from the collapse thesis, but really into sort of the strong form of the threat thesis. And so I suspect that the trade war was inspired by a desire to undercut China's capacity to make structural economic reforms once they had consolidated the anti-corruption campaign. And then, of course, this is further undermined by the COVID experience, as well as now the pressures the United States is trying to bring to China with tech decoupling and trying to push China back technologically. It's all about trying to prevent China from making reforms and trying to do unto China as the U.S. did unto Japan in the 1980s, right? Which is to push a competitor or near competitor into the middle income trap. So the problem is, because of COVID and because of the U.S. Policies, it's still been difficult for China to reform the state-owned enterprises. We are seeing some market corrections of the property problem now, and the government is letting some of that market correction happen while also trying to mitigate increasingly some of the negative effects associated with that. So that problem is being managed. But how are they going to reform the state-owned enterprises? And this is where my analysis on sort of the underlying meaning of the new quality productive forces comes into being.
Doesn't the adoption of AI or the development of the industrial automation will also lead to an increase in unemployment?
So we know from the two sessions that they have a certain GDP growth rate target, and they have an urban employment growth target. But we also heard them say, emphasize again and again, new quality productive forces. Now, I think that there is perhaps a contradiction here. The contradiction is where we have seen rapid adoption of AI, for example, in the US, we've seen downward pressure on employment. So there were some assessments that 5,000 jobs a month were being lost to AI. Now, whether or not that's true, there are people who debate whether or not this is true. Some people are saying it's just being used as an excuse to once again savage the working class. And as a Marxist, I'm not. I could be sympathetic to this argument. Nevertheless, it may be the case that these state-owned enterprises and these local governments that have some jurisdiction over state-owned enterprises, they may feel that employment is more important than productivity. Okay? In which case, keeping too many people on the rolls, which has been a problem in terms of productivity, that they politically may choose that over improving productivity. And I think the message is, the indirect message is, no, you must move to the new quality productive forces. You must. Otherwise, we risk losing everything. Okay? Even, they're not going to say this directly, but I think even if it means that we lose some jobs because of it. Okay? So if you're a local policymaker and you're listening carefully, your marching order is to start adopting this technology, right? Now, if that comes at the expense of jobs, okay, then we'll have to find some other solution for the employment issue, okay? And let me give you an example. I don't know this case very well, but it was explained to me several years ago. China, innovated a new port system and building ports, but they also innovated new technology for ports and for logistics. But they slowed the adoption of that, because I heard that there was something like 70 to 80, when this is like 7 or 8 years ago, there were like 70 to 80,000 jobs at risk just in Shanghai because of the new technology. And they slowed its adoption so that we wouldn't have that sort of jump all of a sudden in unemployment in that particular sector, right? So they try to manage, things like this. So the question then for me is, okay, are they signaling, all right, we have to go full steam ahead with this, even though in the past we would have slowed the adoption of technology to better manage the unemployment issue. On the one hand, I think this is being framed by Beijing as a national security, national development imperative. But I think it also, in some ways, could have the effect of initiating reforms to state-owned enterprises that have been politically difficult to initiate. So as you start bringing these new technologies and management paradigms into it, it will have a reform effect. Okay? So I think it's kind of a way to get to a structural reform that they've been unable to get to politically, but by justifying the need to advance competition in an age of tech decoupling and tech blockades, okay, in order to keep pace with the United States, which is moving, by all accounts, in that direction. So that's how I understand new quality productive forces, and why it's being so promoted. I think what China realizes is that there are incredible inefficiencies right now.
Okay.
And that if we can get past those inefficiencies, China will be completely unleashed.
And what impact will all this have on the Chinese society?
So there's another thing. There's another massive inefficiency that we talk about as scholars. And we think the government understands it, but we don't know, okay? And it's the inefficiency associated with the higher education model and the Gaokao. Well, the government keeps trying to reform the Gaokao, and they've tried to reform the education system 4 or 5 dozen times since the 1980s. No. And the Gaokao keeps resisting reform, okay? And it's because it's such a pervasive structure that permeates all the way down to the lowest levels of society. I used to joke that the most powerful person in China is not the president, it's the school teacher. Right? They can determine significantly whether or not your child is going to move forward. And so parents are listening very carefully. If you look at the chat groups, the WeChat groups where parents are getting their marching orders. And the government tried to make school-based chat groups illegal because these were being used to circumvent the new rules that were being put in place on homework. So then, you would have like teachers would then work with a parent leader. The parent leader would then lead the WeChat group and then assign extra homework. And then all the students had to bring it in. And then if they didn't bring it in, they would get in trouble. But it's not official homework, right? But then if the child didn't do it, then the parent would be shamed in the WeChat group. And so then the government was saying, okay, you're not supposed to be communicating or doing homework in WeChat groups, right? So, and why is it? Because the Gaokao doesn't disappear. So everyone's worried, okay, well, if this school doesn't do it, then another school will do it, and then they will outperform our school. Their kids will get to go to the best university. This is the other problem. Why do they get rid of all the after-school programs, or a lot of the after-school? Because, we were having increasing problems associated with drug and alcohol abuse in middle school students.
Really?
Yes.
Here?
In China, yeah. And by the way, most of the research was showing that the kids were getting alcohol from whom?
From their parents?
From their parents, right? Okay, you've had a hard week at work, okay?
Drink a baijiu.
Yeah, let's have a drink, okay? I'm serious. And there were like increasing reports of binge drinking among middle schoolers. And even in 2017, 2016, it was something like 11 hours per day in school that middle schoolers were facing, right? And they were physically unhealthy. They were psychologically unhealthy. And these are of course the Zhou Ho and the Ling Ho, who were already been transformed by market forces and the accelerated experience under social media and tech that has produced this profound generation gap. So in any event, there's this idea that a lot of scholars have that if we can find some way to reform the Gaokao, and politically we've been unable to do it so far. If we can find a solution to that, it will unleash tremendous forces. Okay?
Yeah.
Instead of everyone trying to fit into this very narrow industrial model of education that does everything it can to stamp out creative entrepreneurial thinking. Once we find a solution to that, and I think China is going to blossom in ways that few people can yet anticipate, right? China is holding itself back right now. That's what's happening. And so once they solve the productivity thing, once they solve the legacy issues of the property crisis, and we don't have a disproportionate amount of Chinese finance going into the property market, but is instead being invested in other productive capacities. Yeah. Once people don't have to spend so much money just to rent an apartment or to live somewhere, right? They will free up capital for a lot of other development.
Technology, in addition to being at the center of the Chinese economic policies, is also the key to the development of the Chinese military. This brings us back to the tensions between China and the United States. But in what kind of context all these tensions arise?
Okay, so let's go forward to 1999. 1999 is a pivotal year. 1999, of course, comes 2 years after the Asian financial crisis, where China was almost, we shouldn't say almost ruined, but the U.S. Was perceived as trying to trick China into some financial reforms that would have likely destroyed the Chinese economy. Zhu Rongji had his own Harvard-trained economist helping him out and saying, no, don't do what the U.S. Treasury Secretary is telling you to do. And so China was able to avoid that disaster. And indeed, not only avoid it, but help several Asian countries stand back up. And not the way the U.S. did, which was to extract sort of an imperial return, as was imposed on South Korea, for example, and Thailand and others. But in the case of 1999, there are three things that happen that are sort of threshold moments for China. Inside of China, the greatest political risk to the party are not the liberals. It's the Chinese nationalists.
Nationalists.
Yeah. And we don't mean nationalist in the Guomindang sense of the word.
Yeah, understood.
We mean people who...
China first way of thinking.
Yeah, and so the people who criticize the party, for example, for not taking a harder line in Taiwan or something like this. So, after Pelosi came, China rattles the sabers a bit, but didn't attack. And so some Chinese nationalists were unhappy that China didn't take a more aggressive stance, right? So, and it's the Chinese nationalists who are always who can always assert some type of nationalistic high ground as you're not really serving the national interest, you're serving your own narrow interest. The party is very, very sensitive to this, right? And of course the party has to balance between a lot of competing interests and deal strategically with a lot of international pressures. So they can't, satisfy the nationalists, but they have to try to manage them. Anyway, there were three events in 1999 that some in Beijing took as deliberate attempts by the United States to agitate Chinese nationalists and undermine the party's position. One came with a major advanced weapons sale to Taiwan. Another came with the U.S. bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade.
Yeah.
And the third came when Clinton decided to reject China's bid to join the WTO, and instead revealed China's negotiating position, and it looked like China was willing to give away everything just to get into the WTO, and this was very unnerving to a lot of Chinese nationalists. So there was this, and to the extent to which we know what really happened, there was a published account. Where the account came from, I don't know, but it was published in a Chinese journal. So maybe it's mythological. Who knows who created it? But the account is Zhu Rongji. Li Peng was the head of the NPC at that time. Zhu Rongji is the premier, president, and party secretary. Jiang Zemin. They're in a meeting and they're talking about the U.S. attack on the embassy in Belgrade, which, by the way, let's recall, there are only two buildings in Belgrade that you can't hit. The Russian embassy and the Chinese embassy. And they hit one of them with multiple bombs, right? And so Li Peng is livid and he's saying, we need to, this is a deliberate attack, we have to respond. And Zhu Rongji is saying, we can't be sure that it's deliberate. What we can be sure of is they didn't care enough about us or respect us enough to make sure that they didn't hit us. Okay?
Diplomatic.
Not diplomatic. It's a critical insight. It's a dark insight, in fact. And then apparently Jiang Zemin turns to the military and says, is there any way that we can respond? And they say, not really. Okay? And so this is the moment where we begin to see major military reforms. This is the moment where we begin to see small programs like the so-called Assassin's Mace weapons program that's looking for asymmetric solutions. This is where we begin to see tremendous investment. This is where China starts mapping the sea bottom for submarines. Okay, in other words, the U.S. is on a confrontational path with us, and we have to accept that reality and be prepared for something down the road. So it's in '99 where, under the weight of those three events, that the party begins to move towards, okay, we need to be prepared for the possibility of a confrontation. Now, they don't revise the basic line, which is peace and development are the trend of the times, but they are becoming more wary and cautious, right? So then, but the point is, you know, the reason why it's important to say that is because there's this perception in the West that it is China that is becoming more aggressive, that it is China that is pushing the U.S. into an aggressive or counter-aggressive position. No. That's not what happens.
And how is China preparing for a possible military confrontation?
So what happens is China begins to develop these asymmetric weapons capacities. And the two big early breakthroughs are the carrier killer missiles and what we sometimes call ghost radar. Okay? And the carrier killer missiles, we all know what these are. They're the missiles that can take out the American carrier groups, right? And the U.S. Navy says, actually, we can stop them. But this is not true, right? They can stop one or two. But it's not going to be one or two coming. It's going to be, you know, a bunch, all right? So this was, in fact, an effective development that substantially mitigates the ability of U.S. carrier groups to operate within close quarters. The second is what we call, or sometimes called, ghost radar. So when the United States attacks you, the first thing they do is they try to blind you. They try to knock out your radar. So they have the radar evading planes, so forth and so on, and they carry anti-radar missiles. And so they come in real high or real quiet, and they start trying to strike your radar installation. And the ghost radar, what it does is it creates these radar signatures, thousands of radar signatures, so you can't tell which ones are real.
Confusing.
Okay? And so it takes away or decreases the extent to which the U.S. can identify, and because some of the actual radar is mobile, it creates all of this stuff so that the U.S. can't initiate that first wave. So how does the U.S. respond to this? They bring U.S. submarines up onto the continental shelf, and they create the Great Underwater Sonar Wall. Okay? Now, the real danger to China, there are two real dangers to China. The first is the U.S. believed that China had a no nukes first military principle, so that as long as you engage China in conventional weapons, they won't go to nuclear, right? So the U.S. position was, okay, if we can dominate China with conventional weapons, then we can dominate them. So this is why in the 1980s, what were Chinese strategic thinkers obsessed with? Syria. They're obsessed with Syria. Why? Syria. Why? Because the Soviets had a big base in Syria. And the United States was messing around in Lebanon, okay? And the idea was, okay, if the Soviet Union falls, and remember, Mao thinks they're going to fall, he predicts they're going to fall in '56. And after what happens in Afghanistan, no one is really confident that the Soviet Union is firm in China. So what happens is they're worried about Syria because they believe that the U.S. will come across Central Asia through Syria. Okay? Now, you had the second, third, and fourth defensive lines in China, where they're building these defensive lines out till they're getting out to around, Gansu, Xinjiang. And that's also where they have their space industry. They'll discover oil. And so denying American penetration of Central Asia is critical to Chinese security. So they're worried about, okay, if the Soviet Union falls, will the Soviet base in Syria fall? Does that mean we're going to have to deal with Americans in Central Asia? What they fail to anticipate is that the Americans will come through the Chinese friend Pakistan after 9/11 and penetrate into Afghanistan and then start building bases in Kyrgyzstan and other central. And the purpose there is to create this encirclement of China with conventional weapons. And at the high point of the penetration of Central Asia, given all the assets that the United States had in Korea, Japan, Singapore, Thailand, they had encircled. And the estimates that I was hearing in Washington and Beijing was that the U.S. could hit any target in China with conventional weapons inside of 15 minutes. Okay, so that's when China really starts to become assertive about trying to build up and extend organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they have to work with Russia because Russia plays a powerful role in Central Asia, right? So you have to work with Russia. And by the way, Russia is later going to face, Russia will hold the base in Syria, and the Syrian civil war is in part related to still an existential struggle over that Russian position, as is the conflict in Ukraine, because the other major external security base of Russia is in Crimea. And so the United States has always tried to target Syria and Crimea as a way of pushing Russia back, okay? Which is why the U.S. starts mucking about in Ukraine, in the 2000s anyway. China takes a neutral position on Ukraine. Why? Two reasons. First, because China understands that this is really a proxy war between the United States and Russia, right? Which one is most responsible? It's hard to say. It's also the case that some people in Ukraine didn't do a good job managing the situation themselves. Okay? This is not China's fight. So, should we blame Russia? Should we blame the United States? Should we blame Ukraine? Everyone has their hand in it. Okay? So we're going to be neutral. Okay, that's the first reason. Right? The second reason we're going to be neutral is because you have to have a strategic alliance with Russia. Why? Because you get so much of your energy from Russia. You have a long border with Russia. You are cooperating with Russia in Central Asia to prevent and to still push the United States out of Central Asia and to make sure they don't come back in. And now you've already invested a lot of money in Central Asia through Belt Road Initiative.
No reason to.
You can't put that at risk. All right? And keep in mind, for a long time in the West, there was this strategic paradigm, popular in the UK, it was popular in Russia, popular in the United States. Whoever controls Afghanistan, whoever controls Central Asia, controls Asia. So China can't control Central Asia, Russia can't control Central Asia, but if they work together through an organization like SCO, where all the countries are partners, okay, maybe we can create a security and development framework that prevents these external penetrations that put us all at risk. So that's the logic, okay? So you have to mitigate the conventional attack, and China does that. They got rid of the bases in Central Asia. The United States is now out of Afghanistan, okay? And you pushed the carrier groups back, all right? So all the conventional threats have been reduced, but one threat has not been reduced, and that's the nuclear threat. Where are America's first strike missiles?
In Japan.
No, the first strike nuclear missiles. They're in the Arctic under the ice. They're in submarines. The submarines get under the ice. They can't hold position in the Pacific because the Pacific is too volatile, okay? And eventually they would risk being seen by, they would produce heat signatures or something and satellites could see them, all right? But they can get down under the ice. They can tether to the ice. They don't have to run their engines to hold position. And the Arctic is the midway point. So, you know, if you fly from the United States to China, you don't fly over the Pacific, you fly up around Alaska, okay? So if you're up at the Arctic, you're already halfway here. So your first strike missiles are actually in the Arctic. They're not in Arkansas or other places, okay? Now, how do you mitigate that threat? You have to get your hunters up under the ice. And you have to try to map where those subs are parked, okay? So that means you got to get your submarines out and under the ice and start mapping. But there's a problem. The United States brought its subs in and created this sonar wall, okay? China has primarily two major submarine bases. One in the north, one in the south, okay? Chinese subs, they're pretty good, but they're a little bit louder than they would like for them to be. So whenever those subs leave port, the American sonar net picks them up and tracks them. Okay?
So this is the
So then if the Chinese sub starts getting close to one of the American subs, they just tell the American sub to move. Okay? Now who can get out and track those subs? Who can hunt them? Russia. So China needs to work with Russia on a strategic partnership to mitigate that threat. Now the Diaoyu Island problem and the South China Sea problem,
It's about this?
mostly about this. But the main problem is you need to get your submarines to open water before they're picked up by the Americans,
Okay.
instead of being bottled in, okay, or tracked. And so Diaoyu is the breakout point for the northern subs, and the South China Sea is the southern breakout point. Okay? Why would China ruin all of those good relations that it started building with Southeast Asia? Why? So they could have more fish?
No,
So they could have more oil?
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't make sense, right? They buy fish from Indonesia. They buy bananas from the Philippines. But China never likes to say, oh, we have a danger, there's a vulnerability that we have, and therefore, you know, we need to do this, okay? Instead, what they say is, they would rather the world think China is strong and asserting itself, because that's what the West is saying.
Yeah.
China says, no, we're not doing that. We're just following the historical right to this territory with a 9-dash line, okay? But what's really triggering it is this strategic need that relates to sovereignty and security, okay? Which relates to what the United States did after China began developing these capacities to push back U.S. conventional attack capabilities.